you're here. Hope you stayed dry this week. It did occur to me that this has been Baptist weather, where a little sprinkle is not enough, where you need to really, really wet. In fact, I was thinking the story of Philip, who is suddenly translated and finds an Ethiopian eunuch, and they're talking, and the eunuch says, "Here's water, can I be baptized?" And they do it right there. There are places you can baptize everywhere. I've seen more ditches and more creeks filled. There's water every place. So it's kind of Baptist weather. At least that's kind of what I've thought with some of my friends who just sprinkled. Secondly, today we're going to talk about money and offerings today. And so just kind of remind you, this is where you normally, if you don't give during Sunday school, that little box there, that's the new offering box. And we've kind of stopped passing the offering plate. And I'm at a point where I'm going to try to do something different. That's always hard for Baptists to do something different than the way they've done it before. Today, we're going to pass 2 offering plates. And all of your life, you felt obligated to put something in them. Today, you get to take something out. In fact, there are coins in the 2 offering plates, and when we get them passed in just a moment, I'm going to ask all of you, every single one of you, to take 2 coins out of the offering plate and hold on to them. And of course, I'm sure you've already understood or figured out that there is a story about a widow who gave 2 coins. And that's the story that we're going to be thinking about. And what I want to do is read the story. And it's recorded in Luke 21, but it's also recorded in Mark 12. And as I was reading over those 2 accounts this morning, I think I'm going to go ahead and change up a little bit and read it out of the passage in the Gospel of Mark, the 12th chapter. And in verse 41, but the most significant thing is I want you to know that this story happens during Passion Week. This story, I think, has a whole new meaning when we understand that it occurs the very last few days of Jesus prior to the cross. He's already come into the temple. He's already cleansed it. He's already had the triumphal entry. He's been teaching every day. He's been going out probably to Bethany, and he's been anointed. And all these things are happening. And here, just now, a day or 2 before Jesus goes to the cross, he sees this widow, and he acknowledges this story. So in Mark chapter 12, beginning in verse 41, and he, Jesus, sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to them and said to them, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all of those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. Well, that's a powerful story in many different ways. I think Mike and David are going to ask you to come, and they're coins. And as it goes by, we want everybody to take 2 coins. And I almost kind of want you to keep them close, maybe in hand during the sermon, or keep them someplace on the pew where you can keep track of them. But they're going to pass those and want you to take 2 coins out. The actual word in the Greek is the word lepta, L-E-P-T-A. In the King James Version, the smallest coin that existed in England at the time the King James Version was made was a mite. So when the King James translated it, it was the widow's mite. But the actual word that's in the text, both in Luke and Mark, is the word lepta. It was a small coin, and what you have is a replica of the widow's coin. It is one of them is a lepton, L-E-P-T-O-N. 2 of them are lepta, L-E-P-T-A. And the widow had those 2 coins. And it's fascinating to me, first of all, that Jesus is watching them as they give. Now, Jesus has already had some concerns about the activities that went on the Temple Mount. But here he's leaning against the wall and he's watching people as they are giving at what was called the treasury. Now, first of all, the idea of Jesus watching is kind of fascinating to me. I had an African-American pastor friend who, in their church, they didn't pass an offering plate. They had an offering parade. Every Sunday, people got up and you walked and you came down around the front, and he had a box that said tithes and a box that said offerings. And if you had a tithe, you put it in the tithe box. If you just had an offering and it wasn't a tithe, you put it in the offering box. If you had both, you put it in two. But the fascinating thing was he would stand behind the table watching people as they gave. And even said, I think, if I want to know how much they're giving, I just ask. And he says, I'm just standing in the place of Jesus watching people as they give. I've never been that bold or never thought that was quite the way it ought to be. But there was this idea of Jesus watching. And because he's Jesus, he knows how much the widow has in her hand. And he also knows how much she has in her account. He knows everything. But to maybe get this in a little bit of a better context, we talked about the temple a couple weeks ago, and the temple was a large rectangular affair, and there was an inner part and an outer part, and some of it was wide open. But on the outside of the temple, there were 3 courtyards, one on one side, one over here, one out there. That's where the money changing and the selling of sacrifices and all of those things that Jesus said were being done inappropriately. But also out there in the courtyard, and we're not exactly sure which side of the temple was on, there was a wall called the treasury. And along the treasury wall, there were a number of offering boxes. And as best we understand, this is from Josephus and some other Jewish historians, the boxes were basically square boxes that had a door at the bottom that could be locked and opened. And then on the top of the box, there was something that looked a little bit like a trumpet or a bell. These were all made out of metal. And maybe not so much trombone or trumpet, maybe more French horn, I think is kind of the size. But it came up, it was metal, it was a bell-shaped idea. And the boxes, first of all, where some of them were designated. There was just a general tithe offering box. There was one for alms that was just for taking care of the poor. There was one for the shekel of the sanctuary. But there were multiple boxes, and there was the box. You had the trumpet. Sometimes they were called the trumpets of the treasury. And Jesus was watching people as they came. In fact, there's a little bit of a New Testament reference to sounding the trumpet. So you understand, if you got those coins in your hand, especially if you got a lot of those coins in your hand, and you have a little bit of a wrist action, and you got a metal bell, you can sort of sound the trumpet. In fact, you could take your handful of coins and you could make a lot of noise and obviously draw attention to the fact that you are giving. So Jesus is watching people. And he's watching to see how they give. And he knows what each of them has. He knows what they have as a whole. He knows their abundance or their lack of it. He knows what they're giving on that particular day. And because he's Jesus, he even sees the hearts of individuals as they're giving. And what's fascinating to me is that now, in the midst of Passion Week, Jesus is on his way to the cross. In just a few days, he's going to be there dying for the sins of all mankind. We were ready to do the ultimate reason that he came into the world, and in the middle of this few final days, his attention is caught by this widow and her 2 coins. That maybe thinks that we need to think about that. First of all, let me just suggest to you that because this does involve giving, let me just make some basic statements about giving in general. One of them comes out of this is that evidently worship and giving go together. That there were some things that were going on at the temple that Jesus was not pleased with, but he obviously was approving of this idea that when you came to worship, giving was something that you probably just ought to do. It's a natural thing, it's an appropriate thing. In fact, in the Old Testament, when God is really teaching the children of Israel what worship is like, and he's got the tabernacle, and at the heart of worship are making sacrifices and making offerings. There's always a connection between worship and giving. And I understand not wanting to pass germs and all that kind of stuff. Secretly, I like passing the plate. I mean, I like stopping in the middle of worship for a special kind of worship that was given. I kind of feel bad that, we give online or we give other ways or give it. There's always something about worship and giving. Worth-ship. And one of the ways we acknowledge God's worth is by giving. That's just a biblical principle. Secondly, it seems that everybody can give something. Not everybody needs to give the same amount, does give the same amount, but everybody could give something. I had a pastor friend who kind of said it this way: y'all just ought to be ashamed to show up at God's house and in his presence empty-handed. Now, there's the gift of praise, there's the gift of worship, there's the gift of a humble and contrite heart, but it does seem that everybody ought to be able to give something. And maybe you're not at a place where you feel like you can give a tithe. I just kind of over the years have just said, there ought to be something biblical about responding to God. And if you can't give a tithe, $5. Maybe just want it that every time I go to the house of the Lord, I'm going to give something. I'm going to be faithful. I'm going to acknowledge who he is, and I'm going to acknowledge his worth. I'm going to give something. In fact, I've told a lot of folks, start out and give a little bit, and then maybe somewhere along the line, if God blesses you, give a little more. There's kind of that interesting thing in the book of Malachi where he talks about tithing, and basically God says, hey, just test me on this. Just put me the test. You give it, and just see if I don't take care of you. If you are one of those folks who, like Karen and I, can say, we've tithed for a long time, and our experience is that God has blessed us, and that our 90% has gone farther than the 100%. Well, I don't necessarily want you to raise your hand, but there's a conviction that I put God to the test, and God has always been faithful. But if you're not there, give something. Everybody ought to give something. Number 3, the amount matters. Now, I want you to listen very carefully to this. The amount that you and I give matters not in comparison to what anybody else gives. The amount matters compared to what you have. And that's what this passage says. That the amount matters, that the Bible teaches proportional giving. The more I bless you, the concept of a tithe is somebody who makes $10,000 a year gives one amount. Somebody makes $100,000, they give a whole other amount. The Bible does teach proportional giving, both Old Testament and New Testament. Jesus he had this thing with the Pharisees where he said, you guys tithe everything. You even tithe out of your gardens. And by the way, if you get a garden sometime and I'm still your pastor and you have something you'd like to share, might be a good thing. You just think about that. But they were tithing out of their herb gardens. And Jesus said, that's good. But then he went on to say, there's some other things that are even more important that you haven't been doing. I will just tell you, when Paul said, when he was taking the offering for the famine that was going on in Jerusalem, and he was taking an offering, he said, set aside on the first day of the week as God has prospered. God, and it's interesting that Jesus knows how much he's got. He knows what's in her hand. He knows how much the represents of what she's been blessed by. And the concept of the stewardship, the word steward, it's an Old Testament thing. Abraham had a steward named Eliezer. Eliezer was a slave in Abraham's house, but Abraham took everything that he owned and he said to Eliezer, you take care of it for me. And Eliezer was a faithful steward. You understand the biblical principle is that you really don't own anything. That God gives us everything, every good and every perfect gift, every good back that lets you have a job, every good mind, every good opportunity, anything that you have that allows you to have material possessions was a gift from God, and it really was God's, and He's just let you be the steward and manager. And if I understand the concept of tithing, it's that, God, I know where 100% of what's in my hands came from. I'm going to give you 10% just so you know and I know that's where it all came from. And the idea is that then I'll use the 90% a little bit better. Well, the amount you give is important, but not compared to what anybody else gives. And consequently, that's where we kind of don't let the left hand and the right hand know. We're not doing it to show attention. We're not trying to draw attention. We're just simply giving because we know that Jesus is watching. Fourthly, God always honors sacrificial giving. God honors when we give sacrificially. But the fascinating thing is Jesus sees this woman, and she's all kinds of people. I mean, there's a big crowd, and they're going past the boxes, and they're putting their coins in. And Jesus sees this widow, and He stops, and He gathers all the disciples, and He says, guys, come, you need to see this. This is something you need to not miss. This is something important. And He calls out and acknowledges the widow and her 2 coins. So what did Jesus see? Why was His attention drawn to this widow on this day, in that week, in His life? She gave all she had. What is Jesus getting ready to do? In just a few days, He's going to give all He has. I guarantee you that I think His heart was moved, His heart was touched. He understood and knew exactly what was ahead of Him. And in her, He saw a kind of sacrifice. He saw a spirit of giving, that she was willing to let go of all that she had. And it touched the heart of Jesus in a way that no other giving on that day did. You're holding those coins, or you got them where you can see them. I'm going to suggest that maybe you put those for the next 2 weeks someplace where you'll see them. On your dresser, kitchen table, take them to the refrigerator. I don't know. But I want to encourage you to maybe just keep those 2 coins around. And every time you see them over the next couple of weeks, as we're walking through the time of Jesus and through the Easter, you'll be reminded that Jesus gave all that He had. Secondly, I think He saw in her an act of obedience. Why in the world would she do that? It's kind of the same thing. Why in the world would Mary break open that very expensive, pour out that ointment on Jesus' feet? Why would they? I think it's because God put it in her heart. I think God motivated her. I think God moved her. I don't know what her spirit was. I don't know everything, but Jesus saw her heart. And in that very moment, she gave all she had, I believe, because God put it in her heart to do. And Jesus is in just a few days going to become obedient, even to death on the cross. I even wondered if maybe when Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane and He's got to this place, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. I wonder if this image of this widow obeying God in a harsh, difficult thing. Why would we even imagine that someone who has nothing else gives it all? That's so beyond anything we would expect. And yet Jesus was willing to say, not my will, your will be done. I'm not so sure that maybe maybe the Father put it in her heart. And we don't know, but I wonder if the Father knew that His Son was going to be watching on that day. I mean, can you picture Jesus leaning on the wall, and He's watching, and people are giving, and God puts it in the heart of this widow to go because He knows His Son is going to be watching, and He's wanting to encourage His own Son to be obedient and to make the sacrifice that's coming, to be able to do that. And Jesus put it in her heart because He knew it would help think God motivates giving. I've been talking with folks in Effingham, and they still let me go every once in a while and visit after 32 years being their pastor. And, all the old people remember me. But there was a couple in the church that came to me one day and they said, "Pastor, we want to leave the church in our will." So it was $350,000 what it ended up being. And when it came, they didn't want anybody to know for a long time. And finally, after the last funeral, could share what was going on. And God put it in their heart to leave that to the church. And we just kind of assumed that if God put it in their heart to give, there would be a use or a reason or a need for it at some point. Because God, when He says to do something, He's always got a purpose. Well, we didn't know what it was, but we just kind of said, all right, we're going to be careful with that. We're going to set it over here. And when God shows us what we need to do with it, when there's a need, we're going to understand that God put it in their hearts and they obey, and their giving is now an answer to a problem. Well, the fascinating thing, just to play this out, the church in Effingham now has a bunch of children. I mean, they got lots of young families coming, and it's kind of exciting. And frankly, their children's wing looks like terrible. Just not very nice. And Herb and Ethel, who never had any children, their gift is going to pretty much cover the remodeling of the children's wing. Do you see how God puts stuff like that together? I mean, you as a church have been blessed with some pretty amazing gifts. I mean, woman God, don't know anything about her, but evidently God put it in her heart to bless this church and a whole lot of other folks. But I want to tell you, if God put it in her heart, there was probably a reason for it, and it may very well be, and let me just throw this out here, you at a church are in a really critical time about what are you going to be in the future, and how are you going to turn things around, and what's going to make the difference, and how do we get in a different direction. Well, I don't know, but if it costs some money, I would just put it down that God put it in somebody's heart, and they obeyed, and there are resources available. God always has a purpose, and Jesus saw obedience in this widow, and He's ready to be obedient. Well, there's another one. She gave all she had. She was obedient. She trusted the Lord. I mean, I don't know what you can buy with 2 left. I mean, I don't know what you can buy. I think I heard something like a 64th of a denarius. I mean, you could have bought something. I mean, if she'd held on to it the next day, she probably could have at least got a piece of bread. Day-old bread. I don't know. Do they still have day-old bread stores? We went to them. My dad went to them. If she'd have held it and kept it in her hand, the next day, she could have probably bought a piece of bread. But when she opened her hand and let those coins fall down into the trunk and go down into the box, in that moment, she trusted God for the next day. I think at that moment she had no idea where the next meal was coming. Just how many of you do have bread in the freezer? We've got some bread just yesterday at Sam's, put it in the freezer. You got bread in the freezer? You know, it's kind of hard to pray for daily bread when you got bread covered, for a while. Although it is interesting, if there's just a little bit of a threat of snow, bread sells out in stores like crazy. In this moment, she doesn't have daily bread for tomorrow. She has no idea what the future is going to hold. She doesn't have any idea how she's going to go on, but she just trusts that the Father is going to take care of her, and she lets go, and she trusts God. There's kind of a thing about the crucifixion that I don't know. Next week, we're going to talk about the crucifixion. We're going to talk about the final events of Passion Week, and we're going to observe communion, and we're going to let our hearts be drawn to that. But there is a moment in which Jesus, from the cross, says, "Into thy hands I commit my spirit." We kind of think he says that just before it says finished. I'm not so sure that in that moment does Jesus not let go of his life and trust the Father. Now, I've thought about this. I'm not afraid of death. and what comes after. But up front, I've never died before. And I've heard folks say, well, there's these stories, I died and I came back. You deal with God about that. There's stuff I don't know about. There's things that are beyond me, and I don't know about death, but there is an element of I trust God that He's got it, and I wonder for Jesus in the garden, praying about the cross, praying about the sacrifice, praying about dying, and knowing the plan. I mean, He knows 3 days later He's supposed to, and there's a bit of a mystery what happens to Jesus when He gives up the ghost, when He lets go of His heart, His life, His soul, and becomes the sacrifice, and for that moment becomes sin that we might be forgiven. There's a bit of this mystery, and I think that in that moment, Jesus is trusting. And I wonder if He doesn't think of this widow letting go of the coins and saying, Lord, I'll trust you for tomorrow. Well, this is just an amazing story. It's one that makes me think. It's one that makes me understand a little bit more of the sacrifice of Jesus, and to know that this story is something that is a part of these last few days, this Passion Week, and as we're walking with Jesus to the cross, we need to stop and see this widow, and you needed to get those coins in. And I want you to maybe find a place to put it for just the next few weeks. And I want you to remember that what we're celebrating, what we're observing, what we're remembering is that there was a price that was paid for our salvation. That as we walk and think about the resurrection, there were things leading up to it that included Jesus giving all He had, surrendering Himself, being obedient even unto death. And this widow, I think, was sent by the Father to encourage the Son. And maybe today she can encourage you and me to be generous, to not hold too tightly onto what God has put in our hands, to be willing to be generous, to be willing to give, to be willing to be obedient, to be willing to trust Him no matter what the days may bring or what tomorrow may bring, but simply to trust and to give ourselves a living sacrifice in His presence. Today, Jesus Christ is on His way to the cross. And He stops and He sees this widow. And His heart, I believe, is encouraged and strengthened and ready to be obedient to go the rest of the way. So you and I visited the widow. Hope you remember her. Maybe even ask this week God to just help you to understand the idea of sacrifice and of giving all that you and I have to Jesus.